You've sat at a railroad crossing watching a freight train roll past. 5 minutes, maybe 7, an endless chain of stacked metal boxes, all the same shape, all moving at the same speed, all going somewhere you'll probably never think about again. You've probably been mildly annoyed. You've definitely never wondered why almost every box on that train is identical, why they're stacked exactly too high, or why one company owns more of these containers than anyone else in North America. But here's what almost nobody knows. Nearly every one of those boxes is moving the way it's moving because of a single handshake on a passenger car somewhere between Chicago and Galesburg, Illinois in November 1989. And the answer to why that handshake mattered is sitting on a shelf in your kitchen right now without you realizing it. So why is J.B. Hunt, the largest intermodal company in North America, by a margin so wide that competitors literally can't catch up? Why did one railroad deal make them untouchable? The easy answer is smart business moves. But the real reason involves an industry rivalry so deep that people called the idea insane. An NBA thesis nobody believed, a decade of failed federal regulation, and a piece of engineering that didn't physically exist until 1984. This answer has 4 parts. Most people have ever only heard of the first one. But let's start with what everyone gets wrong about this story. The obvious answer is cost. Trains move freight cheaper than trucks. Mile per mile, fuel per ton, it's really not even close. So J.B. Hunt put trailers on trains because the math was better. End of story. But that explanation misses something massive. Because before 1989, no major trucking company in America had ever done this. Not even one. The math had been better for decades and nobody had moved. The reason was that trucking and railroads weren't competitors. They were arch enemies. When Mike Haverty, who would later become president of Santa Fe Railway, wrote his MBA thesis proposing that a railroad and a trucking company should team up to provide door-to-door delivery, the industry response was immediate and brutal. People told him directly that he didn't understand the business. The exact quote Haverty later recalled, "This guy doesn't understand that railroad companies and trucking companies hate each other. This wasn't polite professional rivalry. This was 60 years of trains losing market share to trucks and trucking companies treating railroads as a dying industry." Here's what nobody mentions. The 1950s interstate highway system was an extinction-level event for American freight rail. In the 30 years before 1980, railroad market share collapsed by 33%. Revenue ton miles dropped from 56.1% of national freight to 37.5%. Return on investment for the entire industry sat at roughly 2% through the 1970s. Just 2%. That's worse than my savings account. Freight rail in 1980 was effectively a managed bankruptcy with locomotives. So the industry culture wasn't just competitive, it was identity-based. A trucker who put his trailers on a train was admittedly admitting that trains had something to offer. That admission could end careers in the industry. Refusing rail cooperation wasn't strategy, it was tribal. And that's the wall Haverty had to walk into when he visited Johnny Bryan Hunt's headquarters in Lowell, Arkansas in 1988. He wasn't just pitching a contract to the third largest trucking company in America. He was asking them to publicly cross a line the industry had treated as sacred for half a century. The fact that J.B. Hunt didn't laugh him out of the room was the first miracle, but the second miracle was harder. Because even if Hunt agreed, the technology to make this deal work economically hadn't existed 5 years earlier, and the law had only allowed it for 9. And those two facts are where the real story lives. But it's still only half the story. The real reason the deal could even happen comes down to 2 things most people have never heard of. What actually changed between 1980 and 1989 to make this deal physically and legally possible? Well, 2 things had to align in the same narrow window. First, federal law had to allow it. Second, the engineering had to make sense. And neither was true a decade earlier. Until October 14, 1980, freight rail in the United States was strangled by 93 years of Interstate Commerce Commission regulation, the ICC, established under the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887, set the rates. It blocked railroads from negotiating direct contracts with shippers. It prohibited carriers from abandoning unprofitable routes. It made customized service legally impossible. Then President Carter signed the Staggers Rail Act on October 14, 1980. Overnight, railroads could write their own contracts, price freight by market, tailor service for specific customers, and walk away from dead routes. Without Staggers, the J.B. Hunt deal could not have been legally signed in any form. I mean, there was no legal mechanism for it. But legal permission, that still wasn't enough. The trains themselves physically couldn't carry enough freight per trip to undercut trucks on long hauls. So here's where the math gets brutal. A standard rail flat car carrying one truck trailer is 89 feet of train hauling roughly the same cargo. A single 53-foot semi moves down a highway. So per mile of train, per locomotive burning diesel, that's actually worse economics than just keeping the trailer on the road. And this connects to something sitting in your kitchen right now. The cereal box, the toothpaste, the bottled water, and we'll get to that. Then in 1977, Southern Pacific Railroad and Sealand's Malcolm McLean, the same man who invented the modern shipping container, designed something called the double-stack well car. The car had a depressed center section that lowered the cargo center of gravity enough that you could safely stack two 40-foot containers on top of each other on a single rail car. So twice the cargo, half the per container cost. The car sat in obscurity for 7 years. Then in 1984, American President Lines partnered with Union Pacific to run the first all-double-stack train from LA to South Kearney, New Jersey, branded Stack Train. Today, double-stack rail accounts for nearly 70% of all U.S. intermodal shipments. But in 1989, it was still relatively new, and most American railroads didn't have the bridge clearances, the tunnel heights, or the track investment to run it. Santa Fe did. Santa Fe had spent millions of dollars raising clearances along its transcontinental route from Chicago to Los Angeles specifically to run double stack. So, when Haverty offered Hunt the partnership, he wasn't just offering rail capacity. He was offering the only major rail line that could double cargo per train at a price that beat highway trucking on a 2,000-mile run. Therefore, when J.B. Hunt walked across that passenger car to Mike Haverty somewhere outside Galesburg, Illinois, and said, "Haverty, we've got a deal." The deal made economic sense for roughly 4 months of American history. A decade earlier, it was illegal. 5 years earlier, the technology wasn't even available. Therefore, the timing was the deal. But here's where it gets genuinely strange, because the deal almost didn't happen at all. If every trucking executive in America thought rail cooperation was career-ending, why did J.B. Hunt actually say yes? The handshake on the train wasn't the first conversation. Mike Haverty had been visiting J.B. Hunt's headquarters in Lowell, Arkansas for at least a year before November 1989. He'd already pitched the concept multiple times. He'd been politely received but never committed. The deal kept dying in the polite interest stage. Then Haverty did something almost theatrical. He invited J.B. Hunt and then President Kirk Thompson onto a passenger car attached to a real freight train running west from Chicago. Not a meeting room, not a slide deck. He physically put them on a moving train and said, in effect, "Let me show you in real time, on the actual rails, what your trailers will look like riding behind a locomotive." And here's the detail that always gets buried. Halfway between Chicago and Kansas City, somewhere near Galesburg, Illinois, J.B. Hunt walked across the passenger car, looked Haverty in the face, and said the line that would later show up in industry retrospectives for decades. "Haverty, we've got a deal." That was it. A handshake. No lawyers in the room, no paperwork. The official contract didn't get signed until June 1991, almost 2 full years later. But here's what reframes the whole story. J.B. Hunt didn't agree because of vision or imagination. He agreed because his core business was already in trouble. The long-haul trucking industry in the late 1980s was hemorrhaging drivers. Insurance costs were climbing. Fuel prices swung wildly with every Middle East news cycle. Hunt was looking at exactly the same wall every long-haul carrier was looking at, and Haverty was offering the only door through it. Putting trailers on trains for the long-haul leg meant Hunt could run 2/3 of a transcontinental route without paying a driver, without burning his own diesel, without insuring against highway accidents on those miles. The driver shortage that threatened to cap the entire company suddenly stopped applying to transcontinental loads. Fuel volatility became a railroad problem, not Hunt's problem. The math wasn't a bonus, it was survival. Therefore, by 1992, 3 years after the handshake, J.B. Hunt crossed $1 billion in revenue for the very first time. By 1993, intermodal was already 30% of the company's total revenue. The deal that nobody else in trucking would touch became the deal that built J.B. Hunt's next 35 years. And that's exactly why what you're about to hear should change how you see every Walmart aisle, every Target shelf, and every Amazon box that arrived at your door this week. So, what does all of this actually add up to in your daily life? You don't realize it, but you've been living inside that quantum deal for 35 years. J.B. Hunt's intermodal segment now moves more than 2 million loads in a single year. The company operates roughly 121,000 containers, more than any other domestic intermodal carrier in North America. The average length of the haul is 1,665 miles. That's a container of California strawberries, or shoes from Long Beach, or electronics from the port of LA, riding a former Santa Fe route. This train comes almost from Pacific to Atlantic on what used to be a continuous driver-burning, fuel-burning, insurance-burning over-the-road haul. Then it gets distributed locally by truck for the final 200 miles. That's intermodal. That's the deal. That cereal box in your kitchen moved Pacific to Midwest by intermodal. The shoes you ordered last Tuesday almost certainly came off a port in Long Beach, and then right onto a J.B. Hunt 53-foot container, onto a BNSF double-stack train, into a Midwest distribution center, the bottled water at your grocery store, the plastic toys at Target, the coffee at your local cafe. The Walmart you walked into yesterday. Walmart literally sold its entire intermodal trailer fleet to J.B. Hunt in February of 2024 because J.B. Hunt was already moving Walmart's freight better than Walmart could move it themselves. That deal was roughly 15,500 trailers in one transaction. Here's what nobody mentions. When intermodal analysts say 7 to 11 million highway truckloads per year should already be on rails, they're describing the gap between what J.B. Hunt has captured and what's still on the table. 2/3 of J.B. Hunt's profits flow through this single deal, and BNSF's revenue sharing agreement with J.B. Hunt isn't replicable. J.B. Hunt is BNSF's only domestic truckload customer. That single 1989 handshake created a level of operational exclusivity that 35 years later still effectively locks out every other major trucking company out of a route Santa Fe spent millions of dollars in clearance investment to build. So here's where you actually land. You looked at a freight train rolling past a railroad crossing and saw an inconvenience, maybe a relic. Definitely something with nothing to do with you. But what you were actually looking at was a 1980 act of Congress that finally made customized rail contracts legal after 93 years of federal strangulation. A 1977 engineering invention by Sealand and Southern Pacific that made double stacking physically possible. A 1984 first-of-its-kind stack train run by American President Lines that proved the economics worked. An NBA thesis written by a railroad executive who refused to stop pitching it, A passenger car ride between Chicago and Galesburg in November of 1989, a handshake that locked Santa Fe and J.B. Hunt together for 35 years and counting, and a revenue-sharing agreement that today moves more than 2 million containers a year through what has quietly become a sealed market. You're not just looking at a freight train, you're looking at the single largest logistics partnership in American history, hauling almost everything you own. And if you think one rail deal rewriting an entire continent's freight system is strange, wait until we get into how a single 1956 invention by a North Carolina trucker named Malcolm McLean quietly redrew every port city on Earth.